Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining today's edition of the Regional Studies Association Professional Development webinar. My name is Daniela Karl. I'm the Deputy Chief Executive at the Regional Studies Association. In case you're new to the RSA, we are a global and interdisciplinary network for all urban and regional research, development and policy. We offer our community latest research, funding schemes, training and professional development, networking and publishing opportunities, and spaces to grow research and careers. You can find more information about the RSA on our website. Capacity building and professional development are important parts of the work of the RSA, and the professional development webinar series brings you live sessions, but also offers on-demand resources on a variety of areas. Previously, we covered academic writing and research, career development, engaging with policymakers, grants and funding, networking, presentation skills, and publishing. Please get in touch if you're not currently an RSA member, but would like to benefit from these resources and other RSA benefits that are available. Today's webinar will focus on managing research projects and grants and is part of a series of sessions that focus on research funding. A second webinar on managing funded research projects is coming up next month on the 5th of October. And then a third one will be on the 23rd of November with a focus on writing a winning grant application. So if you're thinking of applying for a grant scheme or grant funding, these sessions are not to be missed. These webinars are free to attend. They are open to all. You don't need to be an RSA member for this. For the live sessions, the recordings are available for RSA members in the RSA Lounge. Before we start, I have been asked to do some housekeeping. So as said, the webinar is recorded and will be made available in the RSA Lounge for RSA members. We encourage you to say hello in the chat function and maybe where you're from where in the world you're joining us. Please use the Q&A box for questions, and you can also upvote questions if you like a question particularly. Thank you again for joining us today. Thank you to our speaker and chair for giving their time and sharing their insights, and to my colleagues behind the scenes for making everything work very smoothly. I shall now hand over to Sarah, who will be sharing today's session. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. So good afternoon, everybody. My name's Sarah Ayres, and I'm Professor of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Bristol, and I'll be chairing this afternoon's webinar. The session will run till about 2:30, and we may have an opportunity to run a few minutes over if we have lots of questions. As Daniela says, please put your questions in the chat function, and I'll do my best to get through as many as possible in the time we have. Our speaker will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have 10 minutes for Q&As at the end. So all that said, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Dariusz Wójcik, Professor of Economic Geography at the University of Oxford and visiting professor at Beijing Normal University. Professor Wójcik specializes in financial geography and has published widely in human geography, urban studies, economics, and political geography. He's recently co-edited the new Oxford Handbook of Economic Geography and another book titled International Financial Centres After the Global Financial Crisis and Brexit. He's also co-author of the book Sticky Power, Global Financial Networks in the World Economy. Professor Wójcik is also a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and the inaugural chair of the Global Network on Financial Geography. And if that's not enough, he's also launching a new journal, Finance and Space. Over the last 20 years, he's been awarded over 15 research grants from funding organisations in the UK, US, the EU, China and Australia, with a total value of over £3.7 million. So we're very much looking forward to hearing your words of wisdom today. Professor Wójcik, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you, Daniela and RSA. It's a pleasure to be here. It's my first presentation after the summer here. And if one had asked me 10 years ago to give a presentation on managing research grants, I would have probably replied that I won't do it. I don't know enough and it's too boring. But I changed my mind. I actually now think it's not only very important, but also can be very exciting. It can be a transformative experience that changes the way you look at research, improves your understanding of the research process and institutions involved, including your own employer. So on this note, I will start sharing my slides. I hope you can see them fine. So what changed my view of managing research grants in particular are obviously is experience of managing them. So I've had small, medium-sized and large grants I had a pleasure to manage. Some of them were individual, others were collective, involving more than a dozen researchers from different countries. Most of them were public funding, others were from private foundations, because this has a major impact on how a project is managed as well. And these grants included some grants from the Regional Studies Association, which is an amazing source of resources. So I strongly recommend applying for research grants. I strongly recommend examining various ways in which you can engage with Regional Studies Association. I want to talk about four parts, as I see them, of managing research grants. So first, you need to set up the grant, the project. You need to manage money, you need to manage people, and you need to manage research outputs. These are the main building blocks in my view. So let's start with the project setup. Extremely important. First of all, it requires clarifying relationships with your employer hosting the grant. You may have a contract with the grant-making institution, which specifies how the project should operate. But any project is also subject to the regulations of your employer, of the institution hosting your grant. Unless, in some cases, I know there are people who are freelance researchers and they may have research grants and manage them, as it were, on a self-employed basis. So there are a lot of things that need to be discussed at the beginning and decided upon. So this involves the budget, how much of the budget is actually at your disposal and how much constitutes all kinds of charges, overheads that go to your employer, to the hosting institution. In some cases, you may be surprised that you're actually getting a smaller portion of the pot of money than you expected. You may need space. You will need space, especially if you're employing other people or if you need a lab. In regional studies, mostly in human geography, you don't need a lab space, but there may be exceptions. You may need equipment. You may need to hire people. You will need to produce regular reports on the project, both financial and in terms of research outputs. So what has to be clarified based on the contract, based on documentation from the grant-making institution and your host, is who is responsible for what and exactly when. You don't want surprises there, okay? So for example, the question is, do you have to list all the costs and expenses in relation to the budget on a regular basis yourself, or is it something that your host institution does? How frequent is the reporting and so on and so forth. The next huge question is the feasibility of the project. when we apply for grants, we are optimistic because we want to be, and we have to be, to get funding. But then the reality may be slightly different, or it might have changed since you were awarded the grant. So you need to think, will you be able, with your own time, with your own resources and those of the host institution, to do what you promise to do? Or maybe you have to adjust your workload. Then you shouldn't wait. If you have doubts, you shouldn't wait until you struggle and until you have to report problems. But you have to think in advance and, if necessary, negotiate with your employer. You may need to decide what your mix of work will look like in terms of administration, teaching in relation to your research and a particular project. So it's extremely important not to delay these potentially painful conversations, but it's important to have them at the start rather than wait. You may have other projects. You are lucky to get new funding, but you may have other projects you're already working on, or maybe you're getting more than one new grant. So you'll have to decide about the relationships between different parts of your research and overlaps between them. The good news here is that all grant-making institutions I know of, at least, they allow you to, for research outputs, for papers, books, reports, to count towards more than one source of funding. Of course, if the topic of these grants is overlapping, is similar enough. Then one thing that helped me a lot in my projects is talking to people who manage similar grants, especially with big grants. This is the case. I talked to people who got European Research Council grant, similar to what I was lucky to get 7 years ago. And this helped me enormously. For example, people would tell me, how to make sure you spent all the money instead of losing some money due to changing exchange rates, because sometimes your grant may be in a different currency than the currency in which you spend the money. So there is room you can easily overspend or underspend. Usually your institution will want you to be very careful, but this may result in leaving money on the table, not spending actually enough. And people love sharing this kind of advice, so you should always reach out and ask them. And project management is actually a whole set of theories. Business schools have whole departments that specialize in project management. There are degrees in project management, certificates, diplomas, all of that. To be honest, I haven't read any books on project management to manage my research projects. I've been relying on a lot of planning and talking to people, both within my host institution and beyond, people with similar grants who managed them before. And I think learning by doing here can go a very long way. The problem with textbooks is often that they're too generic and they don't focus enough on research grants, and they can be very different one from another. Obviously, it's about managing money. So my bad joke when I received the European Research Council consolidated grant was that, now I have 2 million euro. I can build a villa with a swimming pool because I love swimming. Just a bad joke, obviously, because in reality, mostly you don't touch any money from the grant that you receive. This money is managed by your host institution, by your employer. But this doesn't mean you are relieved of the responsibility of managing this money. To do this successfully, first of all, I recommend collaborating closely with finance people in your institution. So often we don't see these people much. Sometimes we even kind of ignore them or don't appreciate them enough. When you get a research grant, this is the time definitely when you need to get to know them better. You need to really raise the level of appreciation for the amazing support work they do for you. But as I said, this doesn't mean that they can do it. You have to discuss with them what is their responsibility and what is yours. But in any case, the budget, the project is your responsibility. So I recommend being systematic about checking the financial side, checking expenses, especially if other people are spending money on the project as well. For example, people you hire, checking the reports that you receive, whether everything is according with the actual state of affairs on the project. There are many processes and procedures with regards to spending money from research projects, and they may seem quite cumbersome, right? A lot of formalities, bureaucracy, and you will complain about it. But a more productive way is to stop complaining about it and think about these processes and procedures as your allies, something to help you manage the project better and get better results and avoid problems. Projects, especially big projects, are audited, how the money was spent. By the way, my ERC project for €2 million I think is being audited this week. So I had to answer a lot of questions about how exactly different expenses are related to the project, and I have to provide documentation for them. Another example is especially when you subcontract people, when you hire suppliers, when you buy data, you may think, I know what I need, I will just follow the shortest route to get it. And then the department can tell you, but you should do a competitive process whereby you contact many potential suppliers, ask them to bid for this money. You evaluate these bids and quotes, and you have a panel to make a decision. And this may seem extremely time-consuming and unnecessary, but from my experience, actually, it can be very helpful. It can help you think through what you actually need from a supplier, from the data, from the provider of whatever services for your project. And also it helps you to, following the due process, helps you in case you run into any problems. I mean, contracts and procedures seem cumbersome when everything goes smoothly. But when you run into problems, and in real life you do, they can save your life. So you have to pay attention to these legal and financial aspects of the project. And sometimes you will need to change the way you spend the money on the project. And often people worry too much about it, while in reality, grant-making institutions can be quite flexible about how you allocate money across different items in your budget. The one important thing is some grant-making institutions are very inflexible when it comes to spending money on things you never mentioned in your application. And it can be to a very high degree. So I heard, for example, that if you say just attending a conference, if you put that in the budget and you don't explain that this includes registration and travel and subsistence, unless you do it, some of these expenses may not be legible for reimbursement. And often, many projects can be extended. So it's also something to consider, something to find out about from your grant-making institution. I received twice an extension of half a year for my ERC project. This was related to COVID, but and hopefully we don't have such circumstances again in the future. But there are many other potential legitimate reasons to extend the project. People, obviously or not obviously, But in my view, managing people is very tricky, more tricky than managing money. I was lucky with an incredible team of researchers, but I would still consider managing people the most difficult part of managing a research project. And at some point, on my recent project, I employed 8 people at the same time. What is important is that everyone has to be treated well, has to be treated fairly. Your collaborators, your research associates, but everyone is different. So treating everyone fairly doesn't mean treating everyone the same. Some people work best with you or for you when you communicate very briefly with them, with clear instructions sent by email instead of long meetings. Other people want to have meetings talking about their dogs and cats and yesterday's weather, next year's elections, and anything else. And so be it. We are different. And the main thing, your responsibility if you manage a research project is to motivate people. So in these one-on-one meetings with people, you just have to motivate everyone. That's the objective. The objective is not to just spend exactly the same amount of time with everyone, but rather motivate everyone to help them do their job well. It's also important to remember that often we are tempted just to have a peace of mind to tolerate slack and bad work and lack of communication, whatever it is. But I heard a good saying, which I subscribe to, is that nothing demoralizes good collaborators more than tolerating sloppy collaborators. So it's not just, okay, I will take it on my chin and I will just tolerate it. If you have a bigger team, your responsibility is to also to actually make sure everything is working and to be exacting on fair terms. Meetings are extremely important. Obviously, this takes a lot of time. My rule of thumb is to have weekly meetings if you work with people. You may need team meetings if you manage more than one person. And no time wasting. For me, probably one of the best ways you can start a meeting is by asking, what have you done since the last meeting? I think it's horrible because by the time you meet, you should know what people you work with have done since the last meeting. My preferred way of working is to actually receive in writing what people have done prior to the meeting, to digest it, and then to even prepare my responses and plans in relation to what has been done. So this way you are 1 step or 2 steps ahead, and you can work productively, and you can show to people that you actually value their time, instead of starting with okay, what's happened in the last week. Now, in general, you have to care about, not just the work you're doing, the efficiency, though. You have to work with, you're working with real people, and you have to care about the future, especially if you're looking after postdoctoral researchers, people who have less experience in the system than you. By managing them, you become co-responsible for their success, for their professional development. One of the discoveries I made on my projects in the last couple of years is that beyond people you employ and you pay, there is amazing potential for voluntary work. And of course, you have to be careful not to use voluntary work excessively. But at Oxford University, for example, we have a scheme whereby students, PhD students, undergraduates, masters, everyone can apply to work on a project for a week. on a voluntary basis. And then people who have big research projects, any interesting work to share, they can hire volunteers for a week at a time. And it's amazing from my experience what can be achieved within a week with a volunteer. There is a lot. Now, it's very important to manage also people who are leaving the project. The worst thing is kind of, making promises that cannot be kept, and just, struggling with unfinished jobs. And just like in the case of finance, you need to collaborate closely and appreciate the inputs of HR departments. And finally, we get to research outputs, and this is relatively short because research is what we do as researchers, academics, so we're most familiar with it. One important thing about research projects is that it can be quite daunting when you look at the list of all the research outputs you promised on a project. 20 papers, 2 books, 5 policy reports. And you may worry that you will have to change the direction slightly or even significantly from the application. The key is not to panic. If you want a grant, it's because the grant-making institution trusts you and trusts that you can make such decisions. Of course, if you need to change the topic, the direction of the project significantly, then you may need to contact the grant-making institution and consult it with them. The beauty of having a research grant is you can finance workshops, seminars, you can have advisory boards and pay some of their travel expenses for meetings to enhance your research outputs. And you can also fund more professional websites and use of social media that helps the identity of the project. You can have launch events. It's important to have all these things in the budget, though, and to think about them in advance. I consider a good thing also, though we often focus on research papers, on articles, a good way to put together the outputs of a big project is to convert some papers and write some chapters to publish a book. So yeah, this is all. As I said, something I would have considered a boring topic, I find extremely important and fascinating now. My research project allowed me to do things I would have never been able to do as a sole researchers, without teams, without big resources. And this includes some of these books. My darling project now finalized under the ERC grant is the Atlas of Finance, which involved dozens of volunteers, 11 collaborators, and hundreds of thousands of pounds. So some dreams can only come true with research funding, and you can make friends like the one on this photo. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wójcik. A reminder to the audience to please put your questions in the Q&A. And while you're doing that, I have a couple of pre-prepared ones. The first question I wanted to ask, which was, we're now living in a post-COVID or mid-COVID context where lots of work is being done online. And I'm just wondering about your experiences of working collaboratively online and whether you have found that helpful or whether you think face-to-face is the only way to run grants.
Thank you very much. Absolutely important, was really key question on my mind over the last 2.5 years. I actually, during my project, I hired 4 people online, and for nearly 2 years, I never met them in person other than online. 4 people. So this gave me an utmost sense of responsibility, I guess, because I thought, I'm hiring postdocs. It's extremely important they don't waste their time. And I would be wasting their time. So how do you do it? For me, the key was really close engagement online, extremely well prepared, with a lot of homework, with these exchanges of documents before meetings to make them efficient. Frequent, I mean weekly. I had weekly team meetings. I had weekly individual meetings with everyone. I found this absolutely crucial. Then, unfortunately, impossible to. So I actually think you can work just academically. I think you can work extremely efficiently online, but nothing compensates for the lack of social interaction and bonding in-person meetings, and we could only have those after 2 years of collaboration with these people. So it's something, the only thing I could do. We had some social meetings as well, sometimes over dinner, but there are as many dinners in front of Zoom as you can handle, right? So we probably had those just like twice a year, just a few really, to create an opportunity for informal chit chat, and very important as well. But I think at least on the professional side, there are ways to manage that. Also, we took part in a lot of online meetings like this one, so that, because the big problem with online is obviously the networking isn't quite satisfactory online. It's not the same as having a drink with someone or chatting in the corridor of a conference building. So again, only poor substitutes, but yes, I think through organization, through a lot of dedication, you can overcome a lot of the problems. And actually now I continue doing a lot of work online with my associates, and also it helps because some of them are thousands of kilometers from where I work and live, so it can actually help.
Great, thank you. We've got a question from Danilo, and the question is, what problems would it cause if a grant awardee was to move institutions in the middle of a project?
Yes, very good question. So it's first, obviously there is no need to panic. The grant making institution usually, they want you to carry out a successful project. However, we live in a world of in still nation states and their organizations. So some of them will care where you are based, about where you're based. So for example, for ERC grants, I can only give you an example because details will vary from grant to grant. ERC, for example, requires, I think still does, that you need to spend at least half of the duration of the project. You have to be based in a member state. I think member state of the European research area, not the EU necessarily. So for example, you can be based in the UK, though that's a different story, the UK and European EU research. But yes, so it's I don't think it's something you may need to consider it in advance, because if you're planning to move institutions, it may not make sense to apply for certain types of grants at all, because they will want you to be based in a given place, in a given country or group of countries for the whole duration of the project. But mostly it would be, half of the duration of the project. And if it's hypothetical, you should just go for it and not worry, because most likely once a grant is made, the grant making institution wants you to succeed, and usually they have spent the money in their own mind. They have spent the money, they have committed the money, and they want the money to succeed, which means good research. It will be secondary to them where you based mostly? So something you may just negotiate with them. And they obviously understand that people are mobile.
Thank you. And a question from Sinyi Ko. Are you able to share some collaborative tools or apps that you found useful in managing research projects, maybe to do with project management or communication or sharing documents, anything that you found particularly useful?
I'm not very high tech, but I've just, of course, Dropbox for sometimes Google Documents I've been using with people to just share documents and be able to work on the same document at the same time as other people are working on it. Oh, there is one thing though, very important. GitHub. GitHub is a project management platform. Originally was used by software programmers. So basically, if you have a project which involves many tasks and several people, I would say, more than 2, but the more people, the more useful it is. And then it's a very useful tool for basically kind of managing a whole project. I wouldn't use it for a research paper, a single research paper. But if you have a project, I don't know, of 4 different articles or reports, and you have 3-4 people working on them, and each report has to go, each piece of research has to go through multiple stages. GitHub, GIT hub, I have found it's free. You use it for free, extremely simple to use, even for someone not very illiterate in this area.
We're running just a bit over time, but I think we've got another few minutes for the last question, possibly. Thank you for holding on, audience. We'll get through this last question from Bitar Rifai, who's a colleague who graduated from a UK university last year and has since returned to Indonesia, and as such is finding it difficult to apply for postdoctoral UK or European grants. They've had some grants from Asia Pacific institutions, but would you advise this particular colleague to keep trying to look for opportunities for postdoctoral grants from the UK or Europe, or are there opportunities more globally?
That's a very good question. Yeah, it is tough. It is tough, though I know the university where I work continues to hire people globally because talent for a specific job is always, I would say, in short supply. So I would keep applying. I would just be kind of focused and targeted about it, and subscribe to networks that may share such info. For example, in the Global Network on Financial Geography, FinGeo, we share job adverts as well related to financial geography. There are great listservs, email lists, for example, for economic geography, urban studies, regional studies. So if you just, for example, if you Google urban geography listserv, I think it's called also JISC mail. It's full of regular updates, but it doesn't mean it's obviously difficult to negotiate these barriers and get a job across borders. Though I've been hiring some people, so it's definitely happening. So good luck.
And Professor, I'm going to ask you to have a really quick, there's a brilliant question that's just come up, but if we need a quick response if you can. And this is talking a lot about managing junior researchers. You've spoken a lot about that. Do you have any experiences of when you have to manage upwards? So maybe if you're a more junior colleague who has to try and manage the powers that be, any quick tips that you can give people?
Yes, you have to be honest. If the way the person collaborates with you and sets up the interaction doesn't work, you tell them. Give them some time. Everyone, needs to get to know you and needs some patience. But then communicate. For example, tell someone, I had people telling me, I have a very kind of, I like disagreeing, and this is the way I get, ideas ironed out, and I make decisions. So I had people telling me that, and I always appreciated that. So I know they have this kind of style of, let's assume you're wrong, and then later we will we will decide how we manage that, how we do this piece of research. There could be cultural differences as well. So I would say communicate clearly, but never make assumptions. I think that in 99% of cases, people who try to manage you, work with you, have the best intentions. So just you have to be understanding, you have to give them time, and you have to give them clear information about how to improve the way you interact.
Thank you. I think on that note, I'll draw this session to an end. Thank you to our speaker, and thank you to the audience for joining us, and the RSA for organising it. We'll say goodbye, and thank you so much.